related data. In my
Point of
view,
order, Chair.
Mr. Sorbera.
Chair, as you've commented several times today on relevance, I have no idea what Mr. Barrett's train of thought and commentary is in terms of relevant to the motion and the information at hand in the conversation we're having as a committee.
Okay, Mr. Sorbera. Mr. Barrett, I believe that you were speaking about Mr. Dong's comments in regard to a tweet that you had in this committee. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, continue on and just make sure that the members know your relevance.
Yep, thank you, Chair. Interesting to hear that comment from Mr. Sorbera, who decided to offend the sensibilities of Canadians at this committee by spending time talking about his preference and what kind of underwear he would wear instead of addressing the motion at hand. Point
of order, Chair. That's completely unnecessary banter and talk, and it's actually quite offensive that Mr. Barrett would go down that on a personal basis. We were speaking about a company called Stanfield's in Canada, had nothing to do with undergarments. Not sure where the CPC is going with this on this committee and this diatribe that they're having, but it's quite obvious that they're not concerned about the well-being of Canadians and where the direction of this committee is going. So MP Barrett, please, we can do better than that. Raise the bar on your conversation, please.
Point of order, Chair.
Yes, Mr. Angus.
I would ask you to ask Mr. Sorbera to read the rules of order, because I feel now he's actually trying to deliberately interfere and be provocative. We need to get on with this. Mr. Sorbera will have all afternoon to talk about Stanfield's underwear if he wants, as long as it pertains to the motion, but we need to get back to the issue at hand so we can try and get to a vote today.
Please continue on, Mr. Barrett.
Chair, this committee has heard the arguments from all sides. It is certainly high time for us to have a vote, and as a final note, I would say to my colleagues, if they don't like hearing back what they've already talked about in committee, if they find it offensive later when repeated to them, and I'm happy to read the blues into the record again for Mr. Sorbera if he'd like. But they should be mindful of how they spend their hours, with
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Fergus.
Indeed, Mr. Chair, Mr. Barrett has opened the door for me to clarify the record on exactly reading the blues of what was said at committee. Because I took a look at this, I wasn't at that part of the committee when this exchange took place, and I decided to look this up. And here it is.
Point of order.
And here it is, sir. Mr. Sorbera had said, the last example I want to turn our attention to is that of the great iconic Canadian company called Stanfield's, which manufactures numerous clothing articles. The company can trace its origins back to Nova Scotia in the 1850s. Former company chairman and CEO, and then he's interrupted, just like what had just happened, Mr. Chair, by Mr. Angus, who said, I don't remember that anybody has had any interest in underwear as part of this pandemic study. If the Liberals are going to continue to drag us down the hole of filibustering, the issue that they agreed to is with regard to Mr. Bayliss, because he's a former member of Parliament, which makes it pertinent. If they're going to start to now talk about underwear, Mr. Chair, they are certainly wasting our time and taxpayers' time. So, Mr. Chair, as you could see, it was Mr. Angus who made that connection and not Mr. Sorbera. Thank you, sir.
Angus, you have a point. You have a point of order, Mr. Angus?
Well, Mr. Chair, I just think that watching Mr. Fergus go to bat for Stanfield's underwear from the 1850s on a point of order on what Mr. Sorbera had said about Stanfield's underwear shows that this committee is turning into farce, and I think it's not a point of order. It's just more obstruction. And so if Mr. Barrett has anything else to say, or if he can finish it, and we can continue on. But I just think Mr. Fergus's last interjection pretty much sums up what we've been subjected to and what the Canadian people have been subjected to for the last 33 hours.
Point of order, Mr. Chair, and this is exactly the reason why we need to make sure that we are all have interests in this.
Point of order, Chair, on this point of order.
And there's too much of a
point of order on this point of order, Chair.
At least allow me to
point of order on this point of order, Chair.
At least allow me to make the point of order so that you can figure out what your point of order is.
Colleagues, give me a second. Mr. Barrett, please, I've always let everyone extinguish their point of order first, even though I have to say, colleagues, as much as I respect and like working with you all, the vast majority are not procedural. The vast majority are comments, but I've allowed everybody that luxury. And so, Mr. Fergus, if you could make it brief, that would be great. And then I'll go down to Mr. Barrett.
I'll make it very brief. What's unfair, sir, is the sort of the attribution, sort of the drive-by smear that is put to another honorable member, when it's actually the person who raised it. Mr. Angus just did it perfectly again. He just decided to mock this situation when, in fact, he is the source of that statement. That's what I'm trying to point out. And it's no more of a point of order than what you had raised, Mr. Angus or Mr. Barrett.
It's Mr. Sweet, please.
Colleagues, Mr. Barrett, you already have the floor. You don't need to arrest the floor with a point of order. So now they've been extinguished. You can go ahead.
Well, Chair, Mr. Fergus just said that, he, first of all, he didn't hear me. He was raising a point of order to the point of order on his point of order. So when I look to interject on that point, he has now said that, which I was not given the floor by you, Chair. He's now said that my point was invalid. So this is supreme arrogance. I want to read to you from the Blues, and I quote, November 3rd, 2020, 5:10 p.m., Francesco Sorbera, Vaughan Woodbridge, Ontario. Quote, I think that boxers are better than underwear, but that's a whole different story. Closed quote. Chair, this was the point that Mr. Fergus, you wanted to read the Blues into the record? There it is. So yes, he wanted to. We have liberal members who want to offer their
further above, Mr. Barrett.
Sorry, Chair. Could you have the member repeat his comment?
No, I think what we'll do, colleagues, it looks like the temperature's rising. Let's suspend for 10 minutes. Let's let the temperature go down. And Mr. Barrett, you'll have the floor when we return.
Last example I want to turn attention to is that of a great iconic Canadian company called Stanfield's, which manufactures numerous clothing articles. The company can trace its origins back to Nova Scotia in the 1850s. Former company chairman and CEO.
Sorry, point of order?
Yes, sir.
I don't remember that anybody has had any interest in underwear as part of this pandemic study. So if the Liberals are going to continue to drag us down the hole of filibustering, the issue that they agreed to with Mr. Bayliss was because he's a former member of Parliament. And that makes it pertinent. But if they're going to start to now talk about underwear, Mr. Speaker or Mr. Chair, they are certainly wasting our time and taxpayers' time.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And actually,
yes, go ahead, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will say I think there's a little bit of echo coming. Is everything back to normal now?
We're all good. Go ahead, Mr. Chair.
We're all good. Merci beaucoup. I will say to MP Angus, I will be finishing up in a few minutes, so we will not be, for the focus of our attention will not be turned to underwear, as I commonly refer to them, boxers, because I think boxers are better than underwear. But that's a whole different story, I guess.